Welcome to Conversations with the Unseen. My name is Andy.
And my name is Laura. And in December 2019, we began an amazing and completely unexpected journey conversing with beings from the unseen world, which has totally transformed our lives.
And here we are, after hundreds and hundreds of hours of conversations, doing what our non-physical friends have been encouraging us to do, sharing their message with others who may be interested.
So let's dive in.
Hello, dear friends.
Hello, Mexican.
Hello.
So today, Steph and I are here to explore with you the topic, when shit happens. And I know from your perspective, Mexicans, that's just a ridiculous statement. However, from the human perspective, statements like when shit happens or when the shit hits the fan, generally means like things that are happening that the human self really doesn't want to happen. And part of the reason I had asked Steph to come and play and have this conversation was because Steph had an experience recently that could be described by some as when shit happens. And I wonder, Steph, if you want to share just a little bit of that before we hear from the Mexicans.
Sure. So I went through a condition, which I knew very little about, if anything at all, called Bell's palsy, which basically it's the nerve to the face that can get inflamed by something and it gets pinched off, which then causes your face, in my case, it was half my face, to become paralyzed, which makes talking, closing your eye and blinking impossible. It's hard to eat because you can't keep food in your mouth. And so what I do for a living is I coach. So I talk for a living, and I do it with video. So you could see where having this paralyzed face was prohibitive to what I do professionally. And then when I was diagnosed with this, I was told that it would be 3 to 6 months of symptoms and that sometimes they can be permanent. I found myself in a ship where the water was rising and I was just trying to scramble to find some place to hang on to where I could okay, I can create from here. Plus by the way, I have a TikTok account, which I love creating for, which is all visual. It's all your face. And so I was really struggling with embarrassment about how am I going to continue to do my content when my face is so distracting.
Thank you, Steph. I guess the thing is, Mexicans, so when shit happens, it's generally unexpected. It generally seems like it's out of nowhere. And it can be really challenging for the human self. And I just wonder, what's your perspective on this?
There are many events that can occur in the world of form that can cause the human self to become distressed in some way. And the example you share is a powerful story of an event occurring that the human self would say is unwanted, unexpected, definitely bad news. And this, of course, is understandable, that the human self would apply this description to what seems to have occurred. The human self would wish to be in control of its world. It would wish to be able to dictate what happens in the world of form. And of course, this would often be a desire to keep life the same, to keep those aspects of life that are desirable, to keep those in place, and to keep out anything that is unwanted. And of course, it is impossible for the human self to control what happens in the world of form. It is impossible to control other people. It is impossible to control what happens in the body, and yet it does not stop the human self from trying to be in control. You've heard it said that all events, everything that happens or seems to happen, is neutral, but for the meaning that is applied to it by the human perspective. And of course, there are as many human perspectives as there are human beings existing and living in the world of form. And so there can be no agreement on what the true or correct perspective is on anything that occurs in the world of form. And even if that were possible, perspectives change, and something that seems like bad news can later on seem like a blessing. And also the reverse can be true. A blessing can become what the human self might term a curse. You've also heard us say that nothing happens by accident. That when something occurs in the world of form, it is as a result of an energy. Everything in the world of form is energy, and everything in the world of form was first non-physical energy before it became physical. Whether that would be some kind of an idea or a belief or a story or an intention. Something happened in the non-physical that caused what happens in the physical. And so you could say that events occurring are a form of communication. Many events are there to capture the attention of the human self. The human self that is living its life, believing itself to be the center of its world and in control of everything that is happening. And then something happens that reminds the human self that, in fact, there is much that it is not in control of. And so what is the gift of being reminded that the human self is not in control of its world? What could be the blessing that this seemingly unwanted event is bringing? And that would be for the human self to discover the event is perhaps an invitation to look in a particular direction, a direction that the human self has not been looking in. And as seen from the non-physical, who you really are, these events that seem to be occurring to the human self are not perceived in the same way. And so perhaps the title for this conversation could be When Gifts Happen.
Brilliant.
And perhaps there are those listening to this conversation who are struggling, finding life difficult in some way. There would be many who are challenged in some area of their human existence. Perhaps even most, if not all, humans have some area of challenge. This would be more obvious to others in some cases than in others, but the challenges are there, and the human self would want to push them away, would want them solved, does not want these challenges that are knocking on the door, saying, have a look in this direction. Because they seem to be making life more difficult. And indeed, that is the case for many, that life is made more difficult by these challenges that come along. So the question arises, why did the inner being, the non-physical self, choose to come into form, to have the experience of being human? And was it to have an easy life? Perhaps. Perhaps there was some reason beyond what the human self can understand for the experiences to be had. Perhaps there is some gift, some opportunity for expansion. Perhaps there is some opportunity for looking in a new direction. And perhaps that direction is the unseen, the non-physical realm, in order to make sense, or some kind of sense, of what seems to be occurring for the human self.
Wow, there's so much in what you say, Mexicans. What occurs to me is how conditioned, like illness, I am. When something occurs in this human self's experience that is unwanted, the first thing this human self wants to do is get rid of it. And I don't know, Steph, if, what's your perspective on that?
Absolutely. I think there's this first wave of response where we perceive what's going on to then interpret it into two buckets. I either like this or I don't like this. And to get very serious about the usefulness about even thinking in the direction of I don't want this, because what immediately appears is, and yet here it is. I don't want this, and yet here it is. You can get caught in that loop of resistance, which fortunately for me, because I do this professionally, I'm aware of the futility fairly quickly, by the way. It doesn't mean I don't go into a storm of thought that lasts a while. There was the morning after my diagnosis, so a day had gone by of all these meds that I was on and had triggered a migraine. And I remember I was on my bed, kind of curled up, and I was just looking at myself in despair. And I almost had this moment of with the wonder of a child go, well, look at that. I have created despair. And it was this funny little place to reside. It doesn't mean I wasn't experiencing pain, but I was almost in an observer state of watching my mind too, because there is that mind of, I don't want this. How am I going to get through this? Will this ever end? What have I done to cause this migraine? Like, and you're like, look at me create despair. It was a very interesting experience that gave me something to reside in. If I could just watch all that was going on from a co-created position, because there's the effect that's showing up in form, but there was also then the mental effect that I was going through with resistance. And I think that the gift of migraine is you learn to not resist, because when you contract and resist against the migraine, it makes it so much worse. So you can actually make it better by just softening to the whole thing and like kind of letting it flow through you. And so that is the gift, and that horrible experience, if you can find it. Sometimes I can't find it. I'll go in and out of it like a revolving door. I'm in it for a minute and then I'm out contracted and resisting, and then I'm in. And so it's kind of that same exercise even with your face, as I would stare in the mirror and talk about this human form not being able to control. I mean, I would look, and paralysis is a weird thing. And I touch my heart for anyone who experiences stroke, because this fortunately was a vanity thing. Mostly I could still function, but to not have your eye blink. I would look in the mirror and be like, blink, like my brain is screaming blink. And it's very painful actually. When your eye doesn't blink, it's a serious problem. For instance, you open up a hot stove to pull something out at 450 degrees. You'll close your eyes to that. I learned in a horrible experience, when you can't blink, your eye just gets singed.
Wow.
So it's to not be in control of your body, and you can't even smile when you want to smile, and the frustration of that. And to go into the dialogue of not wanted, I think is a waste. It's like an energy waste. It's like it just siphons off a whole abundance of time and attention that could be used in other ways, which I, fortunately, once I got on top of myself, was like, okay, here's what it is. What do I want to create? Which for me, I decided to go into, let's astonish myself with a quick recovery, whatever that means. So I just wanted to establish myself with quick recovery, whatever that looked like. And so that became, okay, what does that mean? And then there were some things this human form could research or do. And patience was also one of those things that I could do.
There's so much in what you're saying there. And what's really standing out is when you said, well, look, I've created despair. Mexicans, you talked about something happened in the non-physical that created it in the physical. And that's something that I think many humans really struggle with. They're like, I didn't choose this. I didn't choose this. And what I'm hearing you say is, yes, you did. You might not have been aware that you chose it, but there was an energy that created this. And that's really not always easy for the human self to be with. And I just wonder, what would you say to that? Because this human self has got really pissed off at points, Mexicans, when we've been talking, and you have said, you are the creator of your reality. This human self has been incandescent. The mere suggestion of that. And yet it's something I've heard you say repeatedly.
We would look to the relationship between the world of form and the world of energy, the physical and the non-physical. And this relationship would best be described as fuzzy. And so where the human self would be desiring particular forms for these energies to show up in, it would be likely to be disappointed. The human self will be trying to micromanage the form that the energy shows up in. And so when being intentional around energy and desiring to have an experience in the world of form, that energy can show up in any number of ways, an infinite number of ways. That energy will find its way into the world of form, and usually will not be how the human self expected it to. And so when something unwanted happens, the human self immediately goes to the form and says, why would I have created this unwanted thing, this unwanted event? And that is to see the event too literally, because the energy that will have been the energetic cause of what is showing up in form will be more general. It will not be specific in terms of how it shows up. But there is an energy behind what is occurring or seems to be occurring in that moment. And the invitation is to look beyond the form to the energy and to expand one's awareness to connect with that source energy so as to become more aware, which would be one of the intentions that the inner being would have for the journey into form, to expand its awareness, to have an adventure, to enjoy the adventure, and ultimately to raise its vibration. And these invitations, these energetic invitations, make their way into the world of form in surprising and unexpected ways, sometimes more delightful than others. And so to anyone who questions the idea that perhaps energetically what is happening is a reflection of an energy, their energy, we would encourage them to look beyond the form and to be curious, to look to the non-physical realm and the non-physical self, the inner being, for guidance around what has happened, what seems to be happening in the moment.
And I don't know about you, Steph, but when I look to the energy, not the form, it can feel much simpler than trying to figure out a form. Because often for me, the form feels really complicated. And in Mexicans, I remember you saying it's like when you become more intentional in the energy, i.e. the energy we're choosing in this moment-to-moment experience that we create, then we will influence what shows up in the world of form. Whereas, from my experience, I spent much of my life not managing my energy, not being aware of my energy, so being constantly surprised with the shit that shows up. But to start to look at it from an energetic perspective, it starts to make more sense.
And the key word is influence. The human self certainly can influence its experience of the world of form. It cannot control how energies show up. And influence is to be aware of one's response in the way that you were describing, Steph, your response to what was happening in the body, and the realization that you have some influence on how to be with what is happening. You are able to influence what unfolds.
When I think about energy and cause and effect, so for instance, if something tragic happened, I kind of go into this place of like, well, in the unseen, in the unknown, in the non-physical, is places where like dark matter sparks stars, which makes galaxies, and until I understand how all of that works, I'll never understand the choice to bring this in, to have this experience. And so I kind of just fall back to this position of, I don't know that I'll ever understand the why or why it was chosen. And I do respect the laws of energy. And so I'll almost just stop trying to understand, knowing that it's beyond my 5'4" view on the planet Earth to really grasp why a non-physical form would choose to have this experience. And I just kind of turn it all over to that lack of being able to understand. But then I take from it that I can, though, look to that inner being for resources or wisdom with which to navigate what has chosen. Because otherwise I do find it within myself, and I find clients can go into a blame situation. Like, I brought this energy that now took my child from me. And I guess I won't even navigate that conversation because I don't even want to have it, nor do I think with our little gray matter, this stuff that exists between my ears, could I even kind of try and understand.
Thank you. Mexicans?
This was the perfect description. And so what you describe is a summary of how, from a human perspective, it is impossible to grasp what is happening energetically. There is an energy that is being expressed in the world of form, and it is beyond human comprehension. And so there is an opportunity to surrender, to allow what is occurring, trusting that in the grand scheme of things, in Great Spirit's perfect universe, there is an unfolding, and there is a birthing, and there is a completion. You mentioned aspects of the cosmos, and it is no different there. There is this energy, which we call Great Spirit, which creates and gives life to planets, stars, galaxies, people, plants. Everywhere that the human self looks, there are examples of this process, this perfect process unfolding. And the human form is part of that universe of birth and then completion. And of course, the human self would say, when a human comes into form, if there is an exit from form, that is a tragedy if it happens too quickly, according to the human self's perspective. And it is an opportunity to trust that life unfolds in the perfect way. And everywhere you look, in nature, for example, there are examples of beings, some reaching maturity and some not reaching maturity. This is how the universe works, is how Great Spirit operates. There is much expression of Great Spirit in the universe. Everything in the universe is an expression of that creative force. And it would be another example of everything being neutral rather than the meaning that a person may give to what is happening. And yes, of course, completely understandable when the human perspective would be, this is tragic, this is not wanted, this is heartbreaking. And we would not diminish the intensity of that experience. And that is something to surrender to, we would say, that there is no blame, there is nothing wrong that the human self can feel bad about. It has not intentionally created that situation that is causing the distress. It is how the universe works. And in some cultures, there is a greater acceptance of what you would call death, that we would call changing form. Every expression of Great Spirit does not die. You've heard it said that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It only changes form. And as human beings, you are energy. And therefore, you do not disappear when the body ceases to function. You merely change form.
You know, you read it a lot that we create our reality. And I'm curious, Mexicans, your thoughts as I kind of reiterate what came out of my mouth with a client the other day, where we were talking about this very thing about blaming yourself for what arises because you create your reality. And then I actually changed those words about you create your reality into, well, you create your experience of reality. And that to me feels like an invitation to turn to the inner being.
And we would say, from our perspective, whatever is useful is worth paying attention to. There is, of course, interpretation to be applied to words. For example, the word reality. There are many ways to interpret that word reality. Many would say that the physical realm is reality. And that is how it looks to a being that inhabits the physical realm. From the non-physical perspective, reality extends beyond the physical, and in fact, the more you engage with the non-physical, the less real the physical realm seems, the more upside down it can seem. because indeed that is what the inner being, the non-physical self, has chosen to come and experience, the contrast of the physical realm that does not exist in the non-physical. And so the illusion of separation and the existence of fear are characteristics of the physical realm, and so therefore part of what the human self would call reality. And so however you want to interpret the expression "you create your reality" or "you create your experience of reality," you certainly have a great deal of influence over how the experience feels of being human. And as the human self awakens to possibilities that may exist beyond the senses, this can open up many possibilities for creating the experience of the world of form in more pleasing and exciting ways. If the human self is less dependent on what seems to be happening in the physical and is more connected with the world of energy, the non-physical realm.
You know, I love, Steph, that you said about blame, because I know it's something that this human self can do when something's being created and it doesn't want it. And it goes into blame, and something that I've been really practicing is like, is that the human perspective or is that the inner being perspective? I'm part of a community where blame is something that is really coming up. And what have I done to make it be like this? And as I connect to the human perspective, it feels really distressing. But when I can connect with the inner being perspective, I'm just like, wow, what an amazing co-creation and invitation for so many in this community to wake up, to remember who we really are. It's just showing up in a way that the human self would say it really, really, really didn't want. And anything that we've chosen that seems to be causing harm to ourselves, we've done with such innocence, and we've not done it deliberately, and we've not done it knowingly. It just looks like the best option, I guess, from where we're at in that moment. And so, yeah, you know, when shit happens or when gifts happen, Mexicans, I love that, because actually, from an ego perspective, you would say when shit happens. From an inner being perspective, you would say when gifts happen. And I guess the game is, from what perspective do we choose to have, like, the experience that's here, whatever that experience is.
And that is not to negate either perspective. Both perspectives seem very real. And so perhaps the more neutral perspective would be to say when it happens, and to not make it anything other than just what happens.
That was brilliant. When it happens is so perfect. And I love that it resides within that word of how we, human selves, labels it as terrible. And you're just right back to neutrality, right? All things are neutral. Yeah. When it happens. Oh my God, that hit me right between the eyes. A really succinct and beautiful way in our own lingo to remind us of the power of neutrality and seeing the neutral nature of all events. It reminds me too of Krishnamurti, a philosopher. People, asked him at one point what the secret of life was, and he just had this really simple statement of, I don't mind what happens.
Wow. Thank you, Steph. Mexicans, have you got any final words before we close?
There are many, many invitations to the human self to allow the expression, not minding what happens, is to allow life to unfold, to trust that what is unfolding is part of a much wider perspective, a bigger picture. And each expression of Great Spirit has a part to play. Every blade of grass, every human being, everything in the physical realm and everything in the universe has its perfect place. It brings an energy, it makes a contribution, and it moves on to whatever is next. And to connect with that wider perspective can bring relief in the heat of the moment when life seems intense. And to anyone listening who may have it happening, we flow love.
Thank you, Mexicans. And we flow love to you.
Gratefully received.
Yes, thank you.
Until next time.
Until next time.
You've been listening to Conversations with the Unseen.
If you'd like to know when there's a new conversation available, then remember to subscribe and also to share it with others.
If you'd like to have a written transcript of each conversation, then you'll find this on the website conversationswiththeunseen.com.
And if you have a question you'd like us to ask on your behalf, or if you would like to join the mailing list, then you can also do that on the website conversationswiththeunseen.com.
Until next time.